Good evening, everyone. It's so great to see you all, and I want to thank you because I know everybody has a busy life. I want to thank you for being here to join us for this panel, which is entitled, Is Anybody Listening? How the Canadian Youth Climate Assembly Can Shape the National Conversation on Climate. Is anybody listening? Right? In this moment that we're living through, it's really hard, right, to break through on issues, such important, critical issues like climate, while at the same time there's so much danger, noise, fear in the bigger environment. I just want to acknowledge we are here to talk about something extremely important, and we know there are a lot of other very important things that are linked to what we're talking about here tonight. Before we get started, though, I would like to acknowledge there were gathered, all of us here in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq peoples. My name is Mary Coyle. I'm a senator. I'm co-chair of Senators for Climate Solutions, and I'm very honored to join Dr. Linda Harling-Stalker, Director of the Brian Mulroney Institute of Government, in welcoming you to this panel discussion on the Canadian Youth Climate Assembly. This first Citizens' Assembly ever on climate in Canada was held last August through to October. The final report, right here, it's a very impressive report. You will have it by scanning this QR code on your nice little postcard that I gave you. So you'll have access to this report, and I really encourage you to have a good look at the report. You're going to hear about that tonight. It was presented by Youth Climate Assembly members at the annual Environmental Leadership Canada breakfast at the Chateau Laurier Hotel in Ottawa, this final report, on November 6th. Canada's Minister of Environment and Climate Change was present, as were many members of Parliament of all stripes and senators from all groups. The Canadian Youth Climate Assembly brought together a very diverse group of 36 young people aged 18 to 25 from all across the country to learn from experts about climate change, about Canada's climate commitments, where we are in meeting those commitments, and what the pathways are, the various pathways, to get us to meet those commitments. Assembly members also learned about the roles of parliamentarians and the two houses of Parliament. Remember that? We're going to be testing on it, don't we? They were taught about deliberative processes, how to take what they had learned and discuss it respectfully with each other, weighing the trade-offs, because there are always trade-offs, and coming to a consensus on a report which outlined their principles, their priorities, and their recommendations. They were charged with the task of answering the question, what do young Canadians want parliamentarians to do to meet Canada's climate commitments in a way that reflects their values and their priorities, the values of young Canadians and the priorities of young Canadians. This is an historic and very important deliberative democracy effort. Here at StFX, over there in Warren Gardens, between the two Coady Institute complexes, there's a bronze monument to Moses Coady, created by the same artist who created the monument to the famous 5 women in front of the Senate of Canada building in Ottawa. Facing that Coady monument here on the StFX campus is a colonnade with the Moses Coady quote, which says, in a democracy, the people don't sit in the social and economic bleachers. They all play the game. That is what citizens' assemblies are all about. We're reminded that democracy is not a spectator sport. At its best, it is a living practice that invites people in. It strengthens legitimacy, it improves decisions, and it renews trust. It underlines the importance of listening to citizens beyond the ballot box, right? We all associate the ballot box with democracy, but this is beyond the ballot box. We're very fortunate today to have two Assembly members with us. Dylan Clark, here, a StFX student studying information systems, and you're about to meet Lister DeVitre soon, who's studying sustainability, chemistry, and Indigenous studies at Dalhousie University. Both of these young men are originally from BC. Dylan and Lister were chosen by civic lottery from among the 700 young people who applied to participate in this assembly. This first in the world Citizens Assembly on climate targeting 18 to 25-year-olds, so first in the world. They will speak to their experiences, all the work that they did as part of the Canadian Youth Climate Assembly, as well as about the report that they presented to senators and MPs, both in the Senate chamber and then in final version in November. I wanted to also mention that the chair of the StFX Board of Governors, Lisa Raitt, was a member of the Canadian Youth Climate Assembly Advisory and Oversight Body. So that's another interesting connection to our community. We're also very fortunate to have with us Dr. Lavinia Stan, the Victor Philip Dadele Chair in Democracy and Governance, and Dr. Dave Risk, the Brian Mulroney Institute of Government Research Chair in Climate Science and Policy. Both of these distinguished professors will be responding to what the Assembly members share with us. Now, before handing over the proceedings to our moderator, Dr. Harling Stalker, I would like to play a very short video clip. This is a 5-minute clip of the presentation in the Senate chamber of the results of the work of the Climate Assembly. So it's just 5 minutes. There is a full video that you can see, but we won't show that tonight. I showed this same video at COP30 in Brazil, in Belém, Brazil, in November, to a panel, as part of our panel there, showing what we were doing in Canada to the world. So, thank you.
Here in Canada and around the world, we all know that we're experiencing increasingly severe impacts of climate change. The Canadian Climate Institute warned this week that Canada will not meet its 2030 emissions reductions targets. Against this backdrop, we are convening Canada's first ever Citizens Assembly on climate. They've been learning together, deliberating together, and finding ways to come together on their priority recommendations, which we're about to hear. It will inform our work as legislators, and I can assure you that the members of Senators for Climate Solutions and the All-Party Climate Caucus are ready to listen and to act.
Climate change is one of the most urgent and complex issues we face. It affects everything: our economy, our health, our communities, our future. We need solutions that are informed, inclusive, and grounded in lived experience. As parliamentarians, we have a fundamental responsibility to reflect the voices of all Canadians. That includes young people. Your generation will live with the consequences of today's decisions more than any other. That means your voices aren't optional, they are essential.
This Assembly has spent 35 hours together learning about and deliberating on climate change and climate action so that they can deliver recommendations on how Canada can meet its climate commitments in a way that reflects the values and priorities of their generation. This is the first Citizens Assembly on climate change in Canada, and it is the first in the world of this age group. Their generation, as will the generations that follow them, will bear the brunt of decisions made today. They want Canada to meet its climate commitments, and they're ambitious and they are realistic. This generation wants better preparedness so that they can adapt to the effects of climate change being felt now and are expected to intensify. And they want accountability and engagement that will rebuild public trust in our systems of government and spark meaningful conversations about climate change and how to address it across the country.
We've experienced firsthand the effects of climate change impacting our childhoods, our education, and our careers, and we know not enough is being done.
The Canadian Youth Climate Assembly has identified 6 principles that we believe should underpin the decision-making of parliamentarians. The principle of collaboration, intergenerational resilience, systems thinking,
transparency, non-partisanship, equity, We urge parliamentarians to ensure that all governmental departments take part in the production of an annual comprehensive report that assesses climate risks and their economic impacts at a national scale. We urge parliamentarians to review, in collaboration with farmers of varying scales and agricultural unions, the existing agricultural policies.
We urge the Senators for Climate Solutions to strengthen and invest in incentive programs to ensure that communities adopt retrofits and sustainable technologies. We urge Senators for Climate Solutions to collaborate with provinces and territories to enforce and advance the development or redevelopment of resilient and sustainable infrastructure in communities impacted by climate emergencies.
We urge parliamentarians to review legislation to support transit-oriented development. We urge parliamentarians to encourage interprovincial and interterritorial cooperation on connecting east-west and north-south energy grids.
We urge parliamentarians to require large corporations, high-emitting industries to disclose all their emissions, Scope 1, 2, and 3, in a publicly accessible manner to increase transparency and accountability. We urge government to meaningfully engage youth early in decision-making processes in a demographically representative, low-barrier, and inclusive manner.
How can we, of my generation and your generation, better inform and educate those who follow you?
Why we are not moving? What's wrong with us? Be honest, be bold, tell us.
Is there growth in skepticism? Are people more concerned about something else? Why is that happening, and how do we talk to those people who are climate skeptics?
Because we're not going to be able to, deal with this crisis by just doing what we've been doing. We have to, try some new things.
I believe the issue is that we are turning this issue into a partisan issue.
I don't think that there is a lack of urgency in the younger generation. I think that it's the older generations that need to create spaces to hear that urgency.
Good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you could all join us. Just a quick note, I saw Mira Gillis did the video. So Mira's a lovely person if you ever get to meet her. Good friend of my daughter's, so lovely to see her name up there. So my job today is to ask questions, probing questions perhaps, but to give us more of a sense of both what the Assembly was about, where it came from, and its potential influence in Parliament. This will be followed by hearing about the experiences that the students had during their time at the Assembly. And then we'll wrap up our presentation portion with reflections from our two chairs from the Mulroney Institute. If there's time, we will open up the floor if there's any questions that folks in the audience might have at that time. So sit back, be ready to hear about this wonderful initiative. And as I said, hopefully we'll have time at the end for any questions you might have. So first, I'd like to turn to Senator Coyle and ask what inspired the formation of the Assembly?
What inspired it? Can you hear me all right? Okay, great. Well, this is kind of ancient history. When I first became a senator 8 years ago, believe it or not, there wasn't a whole lot of talk about environment or climate in the Senate, and it surprised me. There was a lot of talk when we passed Bill C-69, which was the Impact Assessment Act. There was a lot of concern and then a lot of support for that bill. There was also a lot of debate and then ultimately passed Bill C-48, which you're hearing more about these days, which is the oil tanker ban off the coast, west coast of Canada, right? We've heard about the possible repealing of that bill. But I was surprised that there wasn't much. And so I started an inquiry in the Senate, which is basically a conversation to ask senators to talk about climate issues. How are we going to get to Canada's net zero commitments? Because we have commitments. How are we going to get there? And I learned through another senator about citizens' assemblies. I have to say I knew about deliberative democracy, but I really didn't know much about what a citizens' assembly was. And the more I learned about it, the more I thought, this is important, because what you're doing with a citizens' assembly is you're bringing together a representative group of citizens. It's not no offense, but it's not your usual suspects. It's not all climate activists. It's your rank and file Canadians coming together to work together, as we all need to do, around the tough questions. And this tough question is, how are we going to get to our net zero commitments? And what do those Canadians think we have to do? But they don't just come and spout off in a citizen assembly as you might in a town hall. No, no, no. There's a long learning process, right, Dylan? 35 hours of sessions on, you know, everything that we've talked about, and you'll hear more about it. 35 hours of sessions, people chosen through a lottery system so that they're representative of, in this case, this age group across Canada. And you're learning how to deliberate respectfully and make those trade-offs and come up with that consensus. And that gives so much legitimacy to this. And so I was very much attracted to it. It took us a few years to find good partners and the support that was required, but we had a breakthrough this past year with Environmental Leadership Canada, a wonderful organization that's national and supports youth and climate. And they got money. I can't get money, I'm a senator. And we worked in partnership with Canada's best deliberative democracy organization that knows citizens' assemblies inside out, has run citizens' assemblies on all kinds of things across Canada, and is connected in with a knowledge network on climate assemblies. There have been over 20 in the world, climate assemblies. There have been over 700 citizens' assemblies in the world. And so it all came together, and we made it happen last year.
Great. So you had mentioned that this was a lottery system that to be part of the Canadian Youth Climate Assembly. How did that play out? How was that? How did that come together?
So when you're just working for any age group across Canada, it's normally by postal code. So people are mailed, you know, little invitations to whatever that citizen assembly is about, right? For instance, in Ireland, it was about women's reproductive rights. It was about divorce. You know, those things were handled in citizens' assemblies in Ireland with the general population. Because we were focused on the 18 to 25-year-old age group, a little different than just sending it to postal codes. So social media was used to get the word out all across through youth organizations, through universities, through colleges, through workplaces, through agricultural, through 4-H, you name it. And 5,000 envelopes were sent, particularly to rural addresses, randomly selected as well, to make sure there was good rural representation. And then of those 700 applicants that came in, which was amazing, they were chosen so that you had representation across the provinces and territories, and you had good representation of diversity of that population. And so it was a very diverse population, which you can read about when you look at the report. It tells you the full breakdown of who the members were.
Wonderful. So how has the work of the Assembly influenced your advocacy for addressing climate change and mitigating the effects of climate change?
Yeah. Well, it's up the ante because what I said in the Senate chamber, one of the last things I said to these guys was, Parliament comes from the word parler, the French word parler, which is to speak. And we asked these young people to do all this work it out among us. You can imagine how difficult this was, because not everybody was like-minded, and we'll hear about that. But to come to a consensus, to present in Parliament, to speak it. So they have spoken. And now the weight of the responsibility that is on not just me, all members of Senators for Climate Solutions, all parliamentarians, is enormous. And I think we'll get into a little more detail about what's coming. This is, so the assembly happened, the report is out. These guys will tell you a little bit more about what they're doing. But we now, because the final report just came out November 6th, right? We really have a big job to do to really not just me talk about it or have sessions like this, but these sessions are important, but actually take it in and see how it can influence what we are doing in Parliament at all levels.
Great. And so what was your biggest takeaway from that climate, the Canadian Youth Climate Assembly? I'll get there eventually. And how did you personally respond to what the recommendations are?
Okay, so there are recommendations in three, well, you heard there's their priorities, there's the principles they want us to follow, it's all in here, and then there's, is it 24 recommendations, right? In three categories, right? There's reducing emissions, particularly from the oil and gas sector. There's climate risk, mitigating climate risk, preparing for risk, and then there's accountability, right? And there's a whole range of really helpful recommendations there. So we are doing a number of things. I've done a statement in the Senate. I'm introducing an inquiry on the results of this in February. I've already given notice. We will be getting the Environment and Energy Committee to look at this. We will be inviting the Assembly members, a representative group of them, back to speak with us. And we are on the backs of the All-Party Climate Caucus in the House of Commons and working with the newly revived Liberal Climate Caucus. So those are some of the things we're doing.
Wonderful. So that sets the stage for us around some of the more formal elements, what came out of this, the more legislative. We're going to get to the meat of it now. And I'm happy to introduce our two student participants. Dylan, who is here joining us in person, a StFX student, as you heard earlier, and Lister, who's coming via Halifax all the way down the road, as they say. So I'm going to be asking a few questions of them. I'll ask some general questions of both of them, and then we'll kind of do a tag team between the two of them, just so that they have a chance to get a bit of water in between and that sort of thing. So welcome, Dylan and Lister. So thank you so much for joining us this evening and giving us your time to hear about your experiences. Dylan, can you tell us a bit about your background to start with and what unique perspective or role that you brought to the Climate Assembly?
Yeah, so I grew up in BC. I came cross country for education. I'm pursuing an information systems degree. Both here and BC, fraught with wildfires. Here's got hurricanes. And so being around the disasters that come as a consequence of climate change my whole life, as much as most people here would have been, it's pretty important.
Thank you. And Lister, can you tell us a bit about your background and what unique perspective or role you brought to the Assembly?
Sure. And you can hear me all right?
Yes, it's great.
Amazing. Okay. Yeah. So I also grew up in BC. A little bit ironic that we ended up as the Nova Scotia representatives, but people move around Canada. There was lots of representatives that were from various places. But I don't think specifically where I'm from has much of an impact on how I feel about climate change. Of course, there's natural beauty in BC, but there's natural beauty across all of Canada. And I think that kind of natural beauty is what started me thinking about the environment. But as I've learned in school, in elementary, high school, and in university, protecting the environment matters. And I guess in terms of a unique perspective, maybe because I'm studying sustainability at Dal, but everybody there had something interesting to bring to the table. And a lot of people, it was just their personal interests. And I can say that's the same for me. So I don't know if I'm that unique, but I'm passionate. And I think that linked all of us there.
Great, thank you. So the Canadian Youth Climate Assembly was selected based on the lottery system, as we heard. And the two of you were two of the 36 members selected out of the 700 applicants. What inspired you to apply for the Canadian Youth Climate Assembly? Dylan, you want to kick us off? We'll just go back and forth.
Going back to growing up around the consequences of climate change, the school sent out an email. I would imagine that many of us here received it. I know some of the other people in the crowd have also applied. It was an opportunity to get engaged with both politics and the environment. And so I took it.
Great, thank you. Lister?
Yeah, I agree. It's not super complicated. I was just kind of I'm interested in climate change. I'm interested in governance, and I saw it through one means or another. I forget, and I said that's pretty cool. So I said I'll sign up, and I probably won't get in, but what's the worst that could happen? And I ended up making it, so it's been great.
Wonderful. So we heard that you both grew up in British Columbia, and you mentioned wildfires and various other impacts that have been happening in that province. How did growing up in BC impact your views and perspectives on how Parliament should address climate change?
I don't know that it would be distinguished from any other province, but environmental education and activism was fairly well ingrained into my curriculum. And then outside of curriculum and academia, it was also in the news, the media. So we've heard about it our whole lives.
Great. And Lister, you had mentioned about governance, and so the role of Parliament. What do you think it should play, what role it should play on addressing climate change?
For sure. And I don't think, as Dylan mentioned, and as I mentioned, it's not super specific to place, but I mean, Parliament has the ability to regulate. And so that means they should be doing a lot. They can't do everything to solve the issues. And a lot of, like, if we're going to have transformation, that needs to be bottom up. But Parliament needs to be ready to respond to the needs of citizens and the asks of citizens to address climate change, if that makes sense.
Wonderful. And you both moved to the other coast, cross country, here in Nova Scotia. Not biased or anything, but how is this beautiful province? Your time here influenced your perspectives, again, on how Parliament should address climate change.
I wouldn't say it's altered it much. I'm around probably more people here that are more passionate about climate change than I was back in BC. So maybe more exposure.
Okay, great. And Lister?
Yeah, I feel similarly. The only major thing that's changed, I mean, it's great in both places. I do like both coasts quite a lot, but I've done my university here. I've been here for 5 years, and so the things I've learned in university have influenced my opinion a bit. I'm a bit more, I guess, realistic or pessimistic than I used to be when I was idealistic in high school and we can change the world. But I still feel fairly similarly to before. I'm just a little bit more pessimistic.
Okay, great. Thank you for the background on the both of you. Now we're going to talk a bit about the Assembly itself. As we heard, you dedicated a lot of time to this, which included 5 days in Ottawa and 4 online sessions, where you attended these sessions featuring parliamentarians, climate experts, Indigenous leaders, and leaders in civil society to learn more about Parliament, the state of climate action in Canada, and areas and gaps that needed to be addressed in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So Lister, what sessions did you find the most informative in your work at the Assembly?
For sure. There was a lot of sessions, and it's hard to remember all the details from everything. I was going over some notes I had back from the Assembly months ago, and there's a few things that I wanted to mention. One thing that I wrote down that I guess was particularly interesting to me is that political polarization makes the fight against climate change more difficult. And that stood out to me because in this time of so much political polarization, it feels really hard to get things done. And kind of the problem with that statement is that, like, I know it's really interesting to hear and, like, kind of obviously the polarization hurts, but kind of resolving that polarization is a very difficult question and one that kind of extends to things beyond just climate change in terms of many types of decision making. So that's one thing that I thought was interesting and that I kind of kept thinking about throughout the process. And another thing that was interesting to me was there was a guy that called in from Alberta, and he was talking about the just transition and how in a lot of places and for a lot of people, particularly in the oil sands, the tar sands, the just transition is kind of a bad word. in a way. And when, say, like a climate activist says it, we just think, oh, that's great, just transition. We're going to help people who are working in these sectors that might need to be phased out. But when they hear that, they kind of think that their needs aren't really going to be addressed and that we're kind of just glazing over it and not putting enough thought into it. And that's another thing that I came back to a lot later in the session.
Wonderful, thank you. Dylan, how did you implement what you learned in the sessions into drafting and finalizing the report?
The content we went over in the sessions was likely what informed a majority of us going into the recommendation portion. It was fresh on our minds. We generated our priorities and based off of it, and then we used those to make our recommendations. And so the content we were given was pretty important.
Okay, great, thank you. Lister, can you tell us a bit about the deliberation process that you and the Assembly members went through in drafting and finalizing the final report?
Sure. There was a lot of ideas, but in general, ideas could be grouped together and kind of needed to be grouped together because we came into the Assembly with these, like our final categories of recommendations were a little bit predetermined, although we were kind of able to make it more flexible by the end. But we kind of had the three main areas, like greenhouse gas reductions, we had accountability, and we had adaptation. And so we were able to fit all of our ideas into more succinct and more kind of into things. How do I put this? We had many ideas and we were able to fit them into smaller categories to make our recommendations more general, but still effective. But the deliberation, there wasn't very much disagreement, and we'll get into the conflict, if you could call it that, later. But in general, it was very good.
Well, we heard differing opinions of people coming from different backgrounds, particularly across the country. Dylan, how did you resolve some of those conflicting opinions and perspectives on climate action to come to this consensus of a final report?
What Lister said, I wouldn't say that there was so much conflict as much as there was a lot of different things that we could recommend and a lot of good ideas. But we only have so much space on the page, and so we had to talk to each other to prioritize those. And so different tables, we were sectioned off into tables, did that differently. Some attempted to come to consensus by talking, whereas others were more straight to the point and used voting. So different parts of the report would have came as a consequence of different decision making.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. Lister, what were some of the things you learned from the other Assembly members about climate change in their parts of Canada that influenced your opinions and contributions to the Assembly's final report?
Sure. And I will say that the structure of it, as Dylan mentioned, we were in different tables. And so I was mostly in the greenhouse gas emissions reductions table and a bit at the accountability table, and less so at the adaptation table. But it was interesting to hear from people, especially like in rural and in the prairies, how their communities kind of think about climate change differently. And it can be scarier when they think about adapting to climate change. And so again, it made me think more about what it's like for people who aren't necessarily in the city. Like maybe I'm the kind of guy who would want more bike lanes or more public transit, but if you're in a rural community, those kinds of things aren't going to help you. And so they're going to want different things. And that I found interesting, and also it kind of expanded my viewpoint a little bit.
Great. So at the end of the Assembly, as we saw in the video, you presented the draft final report to senators and MPs in the Senate chamber. Dylan, could you tell us a bit more about the drafting process of the final report?
The final report explicitly, or the whole process?
We'll do the report. So was there a lot of back and forth going on emails as you did it, or was it all just?
By that point, like none of the Assembly members had to actually type anything ourselves. I think there was a predefined format that we were intended to go through conversation and then have our consensus interpreted by the people administrating the event.
Okay, that's wonderful. So you got to work with professionals in a way on this and learn from that process. Lovely. Lister, what were some elements of the report that you championed in these deliberations? What was really close to your heart?
Sure. And I think I'm also speaking for several other people on the panel, but something that's really important to me is that climate change isn't just like this thing that's happening in isolation because we're burning fossil fuels. It's part of a bunch of different systems, whether you want to call it colonialism or whether it's capitalism. There's so many things that are interacting with climate change. And so if we just try and respond to the symptoms of climate change and say, we're going to reduce fossil fuel emissions and we're going to, shore up and prepare for when storms get more intense or sea level rises, I think that kind of misses the point, and that we really need to, that the most important thing to me is that we need to criticize the underlying systems that have led to climate change and not just try and put a few band-aids on it.
Thank you. And Dylan, were there any elements missing from the final report that you thought should have been there after all the deliberation and the sessions that you attended?
I would have liked to get more context on the proposed smart grid. That would have been more content there, would have been good.
So what sort of content were you looking for?
I guess implementation, like what are the barriers? How would we go about it? Some utilities would be privatized, some would be public between provinces. How do you get past those barriers if we're trying to connect all the grids?
Okay, so energy is a big thing that needs to.
Big topic of conversation at the assembly, yes.
Wonderful, great. Well, thank you. We'll have to, next report. That's the next one you can work on. So the final report leads with 6 main priorities that the Assembly highlighted as generational priorities. They included accountability, action and trust, education, literacy and awareness, innovation and energy systems to phase out fossil fuel dependency, youth voice, representation and respect, as well as justice, equity, and Indigenous self-determination. Finally, preparedness, safety, and resilience. Lister, can you tell us a bit more about these generational priorities and why they were identified by the Assembly?
Yeah, I don't think there's too much to say about these. It's kind of, as I mentioned before, people threw out a bunch of things and we're able to collect the things we care about and put them into smaller and smaller categories until we arrived with a smaller number. Instead of having 20 priorities that are each individual and very specific, we were able to boil it down to 6 things that we really care about. And there's a bit more detail about them in the report, but I mean, put simply, these are the things that we all care about, and some people care about some of the priorities more and others less, but I think the priorities we do have encapsulate what we believe in pretty well.
Great. And Dylan, how did these priorities influence the recommendations that were presented to parliamentarians?
Well, we generated the priorities first, and so we had them on a piece of paper as we were generating the recommendations, and so they would have been used as talking points for generating the recommendations.
Okay, great, thank you. So the final report also identifies 7 principles that should underpin the decision making of parliamentarians. These principles are collaboration, intergenerational resilience, systems thinking, transparency, pragmatism, nonpartisanship, and equity. Lister, why did the Assembly identify these 7 principles as the ones that should guide parliamentarian decision-making?
Again, it's the things we thought were important. And also when you're thinking about guiding parliamentarians, you're thinking about the things that have gone wrong in the past or the things that haven't worked, because things haven't worked and things have gone wrong in the past. And we were trying to cover all our bases so that if parliamentarians do follow our principles, then they most likely would be able to achieve what we ask for later when it comes to the recommendations. But of course, all of that's easier said than done, but it's kind of like our aspirations for what an ideal parliamentarian or ideal parliamentarians would do.
So what would they do? What's the ideal?
The ideal? Well, there's those 7 principles we have for the parliamentarians. Do you want me to go through all of them, or?
Well, I'm just,
Like-
I'm just
Sure.
curious, is there something there that sticks out for you?
What would parliamentarians do? Well, the point of parliamentarians is to do what the people want them to do. And although that seems super obvious, I feel like a lot of people, probably the vast majority of Canadians, have a problem or have some gripes with what parliamentarians are up to. So it's very hard for them to please everybody, but you would think that they'd be able to please a larger majority of the population.
Thank you. Just remember that when you're out campaigning. Now, the first set of recommendations by the Assembly deal with preparing for climate risks. Dylan, would you be able to tell us a bit about what these recommendations are and why these were given, why these are the recommendations the Assembly gave?
Yeah, the preparing for climate risk section was mainly dealing with disaster recovery and the creation of an independent agency responsible for disaster recovery across Canada, be that wildfires or hurricanes, etc. And it was intended to be a way to control information flow between the provinces, as well as like specifically for disaster recovery, was one of the big talking points there.
Right. So, Lister, another recommendation then also urges parliamentarians to create a federal intergovernmental agency to ensure efficient communication, resource allocation, and initiatives to prepare and respond to climate disasters and emergencies. What inspired the inclusion of this recommendation?
I'll be perfectly honest, I wasn't at this table, or I like very briefly got to observe them. So Dylan, I can try and interpret that, but at first I'm going to pass it to Dylan to see if he has a better response than I do.
This is why we have tag teams.
I can speak to that one. So there were a few other Assembly members from Yukon and Northwest Territories specifically, Sebastian, Lily, and Graham. And they all gave accounts of how bad the forest fires were up in the Northwest Territories and the Yukon, and how disaster recovery, because they were such rural areas, was so poor. And so that was the prompt for that.
Okay, so just personal experience was great. So do you think the creation of a disaster preparedness intergovernmental agency will actually benefit Nova Scotia?
Nova Scotia has, yes, it would benefit Nova Scotia, but I don't think Nova Scotia is necessarily the primary beneficiary. They'll benefit, as all provinces would, if there was an organization specialized in disaster recovery. I mean, people are going to benefit all across because of that. But it was geared towards some of the more rural-leaning provinces.
Okay, so like Nova Scotia is fairly in theirs. Yeah, great. So finally, among the other recommendations in the section, you recommend that parliamentarians mandate and support the provision of mental health care that supports individuals dealing with climate-induced trauma, distress, and duress. Why did the Assembly think it was important to include specialized accessibility to mental health care for climate, distress, duress, and trauma in its recommendations? Do you know that one? Do you want to take that one, Lister? Do you have that one?
I'll yield to Dylan first, but I could speak to it if he doesn't want to.
I mean, there's not necessarily a specific age group that's going to develop mental health issues as a consequence of climate change. I'd imagine that the elderly person or the 50-year-old person whose house burned down and their family has to relocate is also emotionally burdened, like the younger population. I mean, the youth have a greater rate of mental health issues than older people, but they're not the only ones who suffer emotionally as a consequence.
Okay, so it's an intergenerational issue, for sure. Now, the final recommendations included a section on reducing emissions in the oil and gas sector. Lister, is this the one, did you work on this one? Great. So can you tell us a bit about the deliberations on these recommendations? Were there disagreements with Assembly members on the role that oil and gas plays in Canada's future economy and energy production?
Yeah, so I'll spare you the details on what we did agree on because what we did agree on is in there, but I'll talk a little bit about some of the conversations that were like more animated, shall we say. So one of those was about subsidies, specifically for fossil fuel companies, and what role the government should have in terms of like further limiting them, because everybody pretty much at the Assembly agreed that we shouldn't just be giving free money to fossil fuel companies for no reason. But some members were more along the lines of we can still give them some subsidies, but they need to reduce their emissions by a set amount in order to achieve them. And other members were more along the lines of we shouldn't give them any money because they already have gotten enough money from the public. I stand more on the side that fossil fuel companies shouldn't get any money, but there are fair arguments to say that they could decrease their emissions intensity further, and maybe some money from the government can help them do that. And that also kind of ties in with the idea of if fossil fuel companies are going to reduce their emissions intensity or like in the production of fossil fuels, or if they're going to kind of pivot to a different type of energy generation, say they want to switch to renewables, that's going to cost them money either way. And presumably, since these are for-profit corporations, if it costs them more money to do something, they're going to need to charge more for their services in order to keep their profit margin at whatever level they want it to be. And so we were worried that some of those costs would be passed on to consumers. And so we specifically wanted to have a recommendation to address that. The other thing that there was some discussion over was specific wording when it came to including Indigenous peoples in these recommendations, and to what extent we should kind of address the land back elephant in the room. And we had one member from an Indigenous group kind of saying that, and I should say that I'm not Indigenous, I'm of settler descent, and so like take what I say with a grain of salt. I'm just relaying the information here. But yeah, there was a bit of back and forth on if we use too strong of language, we might cause some sort of uproar or backlash from our final report, and that could like erode the existing wins that Indigenous groups have received, Indigenous nations, I should say. And then the counter argument is that we should be more ambitious in terms of our recommendations, because this is our shot at telling parliamentarians what we really think, and to dumb it down kind of dilutes our message a little. And I think we ended up in a happy medium where we were ambitious, but it was carefully worded so as to not invoke the ire of people who might not be as favorable as us towards more Indigenous sovereignty.
Okay, since you're speaking of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous sovereignty, what role does Indigenous leadership and stewardship play in addressing and combating climate change?
Me or Dylan?
You can go since you spoke up first, and then we'll ask Dylan.
For sure. So there's a lot of things to think about when you're talking about the interaction between like Indigenous sovereignty and climate change. The first thing that I think we need to talk about is that like if we are going to do new mining or new resource extraction, chances are that's going to be on Indigenous territory, whether or not that's like territory that's been acknowledged by the government or territory that some might argue that they should have because they never gave it away. So there's that aspect to it, which is like ownership of the resources. But then there's also the question of like leadership in terms of Indigenous knowledge, because kind of, as I mentioned before, the systems we use are part of the reason we're in this situation in the first place. So if we use some Indigenous ideas like Indigenous ecological knowledge, or the idea of circular economies, or just talking about more deeply respecting the relationship between the environment and us, and knowing that we are not separate from the environment, we rely on the environment. And I think understanding those things is really good. And Indigenous peoples are very well equipped in terms of their like existing practices or their knowledge systems to help lead that charge.
Dylan, how do the recommendations urge actions of reconciliation by Parliament with Indigenous peoples?
There's few clauses within the recommendations specifically geared towards this, mainly focusing on guaranteeing there's a seat at the table when discussions do happen.
Okay, so making sure there's a voice. Okay.
Representation.
representation. Okay, great, thank you. And Dylan, thinking back to the emissions in oil and gas, what role, Lister, what role does Indigenous leadership play in reducing emissions in our energy production?
I think I kind of already spoke to that, but when you're talking specifically about energy production, I guess I wonder if you're talking about like renewables or fossil fuels.
Within that, the recommendations that were made around around the emissions in the oil and gas sector.
Got you. So yeah, I think it's kind of just about sovereignty, and if it comes to, I mean, energy production or the energy sector, what I mentioned before, that Indigenous people have sovereignty over their lands, and if anything's happening on their lands, they should be a part of that. They should be able to benefit from it. And I think Indigenous leadership, especially today, is kind of, I feel like we're at a crux because there's the new pipeline memo that came out, and you have not enough Indigenous consultation on that memo. I'm pretty sure there was like none on the project because they were like, well, we haven't like started the project, so we don't need to do the proper consultation yet. And there's lots of Indigenous groups that are saying we are not going to have this pipeline go through our lands. And it seems like they're being ignored right now. And it's just kind of painful and ironic to see as Canada and BC are gearing up to like properly implement UNDRIP. And there's so much talk about respecting Indigenous sovereignty, and there's all these land acknowledgements at every event. And yet when it really comes to the big projects that are going to affect Indigenous peoples, the consultation is not there. And I don't think the government has been treating it right. And it seems like they still don't want to do that, unfortunately.
So a lot of talk, not a lot of action.
Yeah, and I'll add that the action part, I mean, like, obviously that's going to happen when actually respecting Indigenous sovereignty requires the government to act differently and make a lot more concessions. And not like every concession, like not all land, not everybody's houses needs to just be given up, not all property needs to be given up. But I do think the government needs to be doing a lot more to prove that they care.
For sure. Now, this final section of recommendations deals with climate accountability, and I'd like to touch on the recommendation on combating online misinformation about climate change in Canada. Dylan, in your view, how much is misinformation contributing to Canadians' understanding of climate change?
I think that depends on the specific person. Different people go online different amounts, and different people are fed different content by algorithms. I mean, companies who design these have different personas, and they feed different personas different information. And so I could be given a whole bunch of misinformation, whereas another person might get authentic content. So it's hard to put a point on it.
Lister, is there anything you think Parliament can do to help tackle the harms of climate misinformation?
Sure, and this is in our recommendations. Again, I wasn't super, I went and talked to this table, I did a little bit of switching around. But some of the recommendations involve better climate literacy. So whether that's improved through the curriculum or through a government program, and also possibly targeting social media, although as Dylan mentioned, that's going to be very difficult to do because they have algorithms and the algorithms want to keep people engaged. And if misinformation is keeping people engaged, then that's really tricky to tackle. But if you can improve climate literacy through the avenues that the government has, so say things like curriculum, that can help combat misinformation.
Dylan, when you hear somebody who has climate misinformation amongst your friends or your family, is there any recommendations you would make to them to deal with or how to confront climate misinformation?
If you're certain that it is misinformation and you and you know the source that would prove it's not, I would say go to the source and demonstrate that. Alternatively, you might not know the source, and then it's hard because it's a debate of your word versus mine. If the person decides to argue in favor of their thing, accessible data would help. Other words, pointing out that neither of you are certain. But stating a need for data when somebody's making a statement that they're saying is factual could be a start.
So some kind of data liberation kind of idea. So everyone has access to that then. Yeah. Mr. Wood, were some of the other important accountability mechanisms that the Assembly recommended that Parliament implement? And why are they important for ensuring climate accountability?
Sure. So we talked about misinformation. Another important kind of thing that they talked about at that group was things like emissions reporting and accountability in terms of the government, or they said high emitting sectors or large corporations. We were basically asking that large corporations disclose their emissions in a way that's like accessible. And also, like when it comes to disclosing emissions, it can be very difficult to find scope 3 and determine scope 3 emissions. But I think when you bring scope 3 emissions into the conversation, that makes it a lot harder for fossil fuel companies to just say, look, we reduced the emissions intensity of our fossil fuels, and so now it's actually clean. Because even if you can extract fossil fuels without releasing, say, any greenhouse gas emissions at the source, so that's scope 1 and 2, when you burn them, it's very hard to limit those emissions, and you really, it's much harder to account for them. But by letting if we just say fossil fuel companies just scope 1 and scope 2, which is direct emissions basically, then they're going to be able to say, look, we did a good job and we're going to keep extracting fossil fuels because it's clean. And I think that's dangerous. And so if we introduce more accountability around reporting, I think that will help somewhat.
Great. So yes, making sure we know what everyone's doing.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Now, as you pointed out, and in your report, combating climate change within Canada is a collective effort that requires both federal and provincial collaboration in order to meet our targets. And I would also add municipal governments in there as well have a role to play, perhaps. But Dylan, how did this need for federal provincial collaboration influence the recommendations the Assembly made to Parliament?
Easiest example would be the need for an intergovernmental agency outlined in the preparing for climate risks section. The need for information transfer and the need for disaster recovery.
Right, so information is really important, key to that kind of that going back and forth. Lister, how in your view should collaboration between the federal and provincial governments work in order to meet our climate targets?
I wish this were an easy question to answer, but because the provinces and the federal government have a lot, like sometimes similar jurisdictions, sometimes overlapping, sometimes not overlapping, and sometimes it's kind of like there's kind of like a federal thing and then there's a provincial thing under that and the province interprets that. But I think cooperation is important but difficult, especially when provinces have very different priorities. Like the priorities of, say, Prince Edward Island are going to be very different than the priorities of Alberta. And I don't think I have a good answer for how we can make it better because it really depends on the politics of a certain, like, of each region. Like, if Alberta generally wants more pipelines and more oil and gas, and PEI, like Prince Edward Islanders, think that oil and gas is bad, that's just an example. I'm not saying that's necessarily the case, but I think it's going to be very difficult to kind of to reconcile that and say, let's all just agree, because the situation for individuals in each province is going to be different. I don't know. I don't think that answers your question, but I think it at least speaks to it a little bit.
Yeah, it gives food for thought and reminder that Canada really is a regional place in a lot of ways. So we have to kind of remember that each region has its own unique challenges as well as assets in a way.
Yeah.
Now, another issue in climate advocacy sphere is bridging the generational gap between older and younger people, which for those of you, if you could see our audience here, we have quite a wonderful range of folks here from high school. I think I saw, did I see Jivjit here? From high school all the way up to many years past high school. While the effects of climate change will impact younger Canadians for their entire lives to come, and increasingly more harmful rates, older Canadians also view climate change as a significant threat and face the consequences of climate disasters and events. Dylan, how can older and younger Canadians work together to address the threat of climate change?
Well, this assembly was an example. I mean, typically, older folk tend to have more authority and power, and so organizing events like this isn't accomplished by youth's hands. It was Senator Coyle and co who set up the event, and so setting up opportunities for youth to speak is likely the best way to achieve that goal.
So giving space for people to talk at various generational levels. Wonderful, thank you. And Lister, what can we do to communicate and educate both older and younger Canadians alike who may not be concerned with the threats of climate change?
I think this one is maybe a little bit difficult because so many people have at least heard of the idea of climate change. So I don't think there's many people who are just like, oh, climate change, what's that? Should I be worried about it? I think most people kind of already have opinions. And so there will be people that think climate change is a problem, but don't have time to deal with it. That's a lot of people. But I think the more interesting question is how do we reach people that don't think climate change is an issue? And kind of how do we get here? How did we get here to where we are politically polarized and everything has kind of become a partisan issue? And I don't really have the answer for that. I think something that's very effective in terms of kind of like shifting the views of others, not that you should try to be shifting the views of others, but it's really important to just talk to people and have an open mind and try and understand their perspective. So if I'm talking to somebody who thinks that climate change isn't a problem, instead of saying, well, I think climate change is a problem, and here are 5 reasons why, I would first want to ask, so why do you think climate change isn't a problem? What have you heard? I'm curious to know more. And I think that's a good way to kind of bridge that gap. But I don't think it seems like it's not a very scalable way. Like if the government of Canada runs ads saying climate change is an issue and we're dealing with it, there's going to be a lot of people who say, well, actually that's wrong and I don't trust the government. And that's that. So I think dialogue between individuals or even in group settings is more effective, but it's difficult to set that up.
It is a challenge. So the recommendations have been released. How would you like to see Parliament discuss, consider, and implement these recommendations in the final report? Dylan, what do you think? What do you want Parliament to do with this?
Take it to the next level, discuss it further. The alternative being dropping it. Keep it going.
Ask them to read it? What about you, Lister? What would you like to see Parliament do?
Sure. It was nice to hear Senator Coyle talking about what she's been doing and how she's going to add or start another inquiry, and to hear about. It sounds like there's some progress in the House of Commons, but I think it would be nice to hear more. Like I'm not sure if it works exactly the same in the House of Commons, but it would be nice to have kind of more sway in the House of Commons or bring this report to more people in the House, just because like the Senate is very important. It's the sober second thought, and they can have some influence in the policy that goes through. They could theoretically send it back, and I'm sure it's happened many a time. But just to see it through all levels of Parliament and say not just like mainly in the Senate, I think would be really nice. And of course, like act on the recommendations, but that's a very like aspirational and like bordering on naive thing to say. So I know that it's more complicated than that, but like, yeah, we want to see these things happen. And starting with discussing it is probably the way to go.
So I just have a last few final questions for our delegates. They've been talking along, and I'm sure they want to catch their breath and are tired of being inquisitive, me being the inquisitor here. But I'm going to ask you each to answer these questions in turn. So starting, Dylan, has your opinion on climate change altered since being part of the Assembly? And how, if so?
I don't know that I'd say my position has altered, but the context I have has grown for sure. I mean, I'm more informed than I was prior.
Yeah.
Don't know the position has changed.
And Lister, what about you?
Yeah, I have a similar sentiment. Like, I still overall believe climate change is an issue and believe that there's a lot of ways that government and corporations could change to help solve climate change. But I think similarly, like, I've gained new context, especially what I mentioned with one of the presentations we had, where kind of not everybody sees the words that we're talking about when it comes to responding to climate change the same. When we're talking about a just transition, a lot of people see that as that's a great idea, but there's also people that term worries them. And I think we need to kind of bring everybody's perspective into the conversation. And yeah, it was great to hear from people who are in more like rural zones and northern zones.
Thank you. So you're co-authors of this report. And when academics finish writing a paper, we spread it out and tell all our friends, our grandparents, our children, whoever it might be, until they hear it ad nauseum. So I'm wondering, what have you done so far to spread the word of the Canadian Youth Climate Assembly and the final report? Do you, with or without other Assembly members, have any further plans for amplification of it, to get it out there in the public?
Post the Assembly, this has been the first thing I've been a part of. I told my friends to show up.
Did they?
They did, yes.
Oh, that's good. What about you, Lister?
Sure. For me, social media is one thing. Reposts on LinkedIn, reposts, whatever else. I think that's a way to start. And of course, coming to this event to share my perspective as well. And I would just want to add to this question and say that we have gone to Ottawa and we have given our time, and it was absolutely an honor to have been able to go there. And we're all happy and grateful that we got to spend that time. But like, we gave our ideas, and I don't think it should be so much up to us for the parliamentarians to take what we've said, because the recommendations are there, they're on paper, and it can be read. And so I think we should have more onus on the parliamentarians to read it and interpret it and do something about it.
Now, if a parliamentarian were to call you up, so say Mr. Carney had a few minutes in between his meetings at Davos and said, "This is a great report, can you tell me more?" Would you take the call? Either one of you?
Of course. Yeah, absolutely.
Would you take the call, Dylan?
Sure.
Probably comes up on your phone, unknown name, unknown number, but. So to sum up, what's your biggest takeaway, each of you, coming out of the Canadian Youth Climate Assembly? What do you hope now for that the recommendations are public? Do you want to start, Dylan?
Sure. We've taken the first step. I hope the next comes and it doesn't stop after the first.
What about you, Lister?
That's very poignant. For me, just a couple like fun little takeaways. First, my French is not good enough, and I wish it were better to communicate with my Francophone colleagues. That's one thing. Another thing is that everybody there had really good ideas, and I wish there was a few members who had like more specific and say like local ideas that didn't really get to voice those as much because it was more general. And so I just wanted to mention that. But everybody had something to bring to the table, and like everybody there like knows so much stuff. And it was really cool to see. And what do we hope? It's the same thing as Dylan said. Like, we hope that something gets done about it, and we hope that the word gets spread more, that this is what the members of the Youth Climate Assembly thought of, and this is what we want.
Wonderful. So please join me in thanking Dylan and Lister for the reflection. So as you heard during Senator Coyle's introduction, we have two wonderful respondents with us this evening. They're going to give a bit of a reflection on what they've heard from each of their own backgrounds. So Dr. Dave Risk was coming from a background of climate science and public policy, and Dr. Stan is coming from a background of of democracy and governance. I knew it in my head. I got to get it out. I have to make sure I got governance, not government. We go back and forth between those terms. So I'm just wondering, based off what you each heard today, what are your initial reactions to the recommendations and the process of the Canadian Youth Climate Assembly?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank and congratulate Senator Coyle. Congratulations for your boundless energy. It's remarkable, and thanks for bringing the group together. Thanks for being inclusive, for seeing the gap. It's very important, and I was surprised that it's not a regular thing. Yeah. I believe especially that youth, as probably the least engaged politically group, need to get out there, need to be pulled out there in some cases, and need to be involved. And I think that youth should feel also that they're capable of reaching across the fence. So I think that it would be great if parliamentarians were just to take your recommendations and run with them. But I think if you can collaborate with them, partner with them, hold their hands, you have the in now in certain ways. And so you should keep going with it. And so I wanted to thank Dylan and Lister for your time as well. And this is a big commitment. And I can see that you took a lot away from it and you learned a lot from it. In the report, which is really interesting, and everyone here won't have had the opportunity to read the report, obviously, but what I saw a lot was balance. And so I work in energy systems and greenhouse gases, and I listen to all the sides basically, and I'm in very polarized conversations a lot of the time, and I'm accustomed to that. That's still the life I live in, and I have to get accustomed to polarization. Means sort of closed mind. That obviously you play for a team. And then an imbalance means that you have an open mind and that you can play for the all-star team. So you have ideas from both sides, both end members. For fossil fuels, for example, there are a lot of people that want them as cheap as possible. And then there are other people that say, don't do it at all. And the reality is it generally has to be in the middle, and both sides tend to have good ideas. Good ideas come from both sides. And I read a lot of that in the report. I was surprised how balanced it was in some ways, because I think that if I were young, I would be really angry. And so I'm like kind of an angry middle-aged man. And anyways, I hope in my work that I'm kind of channeling energy for you. And I was just kind of inspired and found it very refreshing that you weren't frustrated and angry, and that you're open-minded and that you're interested in decision making. Another thing that I read a lot are kind of embedded in many of the principles in the report was this emphasis on information and reporting. And I think that that's something that's as a scientist especially, so I'm a scientist, but I also do a lot of work with government. And so I work on policy and regulation. And there's nothing like a little bit of information to clear the air, and reliable information. And in fossil fuels, especially when we talk about inventories, for example, I've seen provinces and the federal government argue with one another on the approach that they should have, only because they're dealing with different data sets. And having one fantastic data set allows everybody to put their opinions aside and come to the table and figure out what to do. And so I think that in Canada, we actually have still quite poor information systems. And for example, we've done in my group, we've done work on agriculture, for example. It's easy to measure emissions, but it's really hard to know where the farms are. We don't have information systems for, regulators have just started releasing the oil and gas companies' direct reporting, for example, for greenhouse gases. That's only in the last few years, and it's from people like me calling the regulator every week to say that you need to do this. You can't hide those reports. You need to disclose them. Companies need to be accountable. And I think the regulators need to be accountable too. And regulators and parliamentarians are very closely linked to one another, obviously. So I think the information systems and reporting systems lag a lot behind other countries. And in papers that we try to publish, international reviewers are often saying, well, this is ridiculous. You just look that up in the government database. And so we don't have them here for a lot of things. So it's important to ask for information and to keep that coming. And so anyways, I think you have this philosophy of information-based decision-making, and I would just encourage you to remember to work with others, and collaborating means working within those groups and not from the outside. It means listening, and you did a great job of doing that, listening to one another. And that's so important. Even if you have a polarized situation, that's the best way to neutralize a polarized situation, is just to listen to everybody. And anyways, on my side at least, if you have information especially, then even in a crazy world like this, things still work. So maybe I'll pass it over to Dr. Stan for some comments as well.
Well, I'm the last, the last one somehow. I want to start by congratulating the young people first, because I think this is very important. It's very important that you participated in this deliberate democracy exercise. I think it is very important that Senator Coyle, with all her energy, got involved, because not all deliberate democracy exercises are finalized as successfully as yours. Yeah, and I'm a political scientist. I'm a skeptical political scientist that also works with non-cases and failure. And I'm actually astonished and, very happy to see all this energy and all this new expertise that you got from this exercise, yeah? The more so since much of this climate dilemma, conundrum, is what another political scientist called the tragedy of the commons, yeah? Which means we individuals have this tendency to prioritize short-term things, and we deplete resources, although we know, each one of us knows, and we collectively know, that without that resource, we will be in big trouble. The tragedy of the commons means that you have to pool resources at the international level, at the national level, with your politicians, with your population, with your young people, with a little bit older people like me, and with people who are not involved in politics that much, but also older people who really go to vote and really participate in political parties. And what this means is that to have a solution, to have this issue flagged as a priority, yeah, for all these groups, I would argue your work just started, yeah? Don't think you will go home and that's that, yeah? Champagne is not for you in the near future yet, yeah? Why is that? Because, and yeah, going back to politics, and we are not happy people in political science these days, yeah? Why? Because internationally, we are facing what we call democratic backsliding. Autocrats, like my very good friend south of the border, Donaldo Trump, yeah, who is using democratic processes and institutions to grab political office, and then in a democracy, and then to turn that political office towards dismantling the very democracy he's representing. Democratic backsliding is not only, Trump is the latest, people, unfortunately for us, yeah? We've seen this trend of democratization. More countries, a bigger percentage of the population worldwide living in democracies. It's been going up and up and up and up until 2021. Today, this morning in my classroom, I was talking about this, yeah? And in 2021, the varieties of democracy, which is a big effort by a big bunch of political scientists, shows us that we are facing this erosion of democracy. Democracy is consuming itself. We've been, for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, we've said, you know what, this is a very temporary setback. We will get back to normal. Now, kind of, not only we recognize we don't know what to do, we don't have a solution, but it's sliding and sliding, yeah, and we do not see any improvement in sight. We heard about political polarization. Political polarization affects Canada too, yeah? So from international, I'm moving now at the national level, yeah? You need action on the part of your politicians. Political polarization means that, and of course it was measured also, it means that if I am a member of one party, yeah, increasingly over time, I'm describing the members of the other parties in nastier and nastier terms. The gulf between us, yeah, becomes bigger and bigger. This means that we see very little common ground for the tragedy of the commons problem that we have to address. Yeah. So the likelihood that we are coming together, we politicians, yeah, our representatives, yeah, in this indirect democracy, come together with a feasible solution to this problem is diminishing. We are not you know, seeing the light at the end of the tunnel here. Yeah. But then the tragedy of the commons also means that climate is a huge problem. And we know in politics one rule, yeah? We cannot address all things at the same time, yeah? And satisfy all people. We cannot even satisfy a majority of the electorate. And this selection means that it might not be the best day today to address the tragedy of the commons, yeah? And look around in the world. We have wars. We have politicians, big powers posturing. We have all kinds of developments that we don't know how to interpret them in political science. My colleagues say, I'm going to class and every damn textbook that we've used today is kind of outdated. We don't know. We don't know what we are doing. We don't know how to interpret things because what we thought it's impossible yesterday, it's normalized today. Yeah. Now, you know, with the it's not that the Canadian politicians do not know about the importance of climate. Yeah, it's we have to keep the fire burning under their asses in a way. Yeah, to keep this a priority for politicians. But you know, unfortunately, when it comes to choose between climate change and other things that are dear to Canadians, it seems to be the case that it's always something else that is more important today. Yeah. And even if it's not, then, you know, you have these cases. I'm coming from Eastern Europe. Yeah. And unfortunately, in Eastern Europe, Canada does not have a good reputation when it comes to climate projects. Why? Because actually one of the biggest protest action in Eastern Europe was addressed against a Canadian company, Gabriel Resources, which wanted to destroy entire villages for, you know, some gold mines there. Yeah. So it's like we might say the right thing for the Canadian public, but we champion the interest of corporations or the interest of economic entities in Canada when it comes to things abroad. Yeah, so that's another challenge that we have to face. And then, you know, I'm thinking about young people. Young people, David, Dr. Riska also mentioned here that the young people don't really vote, which is a fact. Yeah, you should get more involved politically, but also the hard reality is that you later will make the same choices as we do, meaning you might prioritize economic, financial prosperity, yeah, and deprioritize climate. So in a way, my message to you would say, let's remember what Václav Havel, another Eastern European, said, yeah, the power of the powerless. We are all powerless here, but together, and especially you, with your knowledge, yeah, this was a two-way, an interactive type of exercise. Is not, I mean, Senator Coyle heard from you, but you also heard from this exercise how to shape, how to articulate your ideas, how to prioritize some things within the big climate basket. Yeah. So I would say you should go out. My proposal. You should go out and you should become champions of climate change and climate solution type of platform out there. I would start with universities because you are university students. You speak this language, yeah, better than I speak to them, yeah. So go out, make your words known, make the report known, yeah, in your age cohort, but then in other age cohorts, and each one of us this way can do our job, our little bit of change, but put together, yeah, as Prime Minister Carney said in Davos, yeah, all of us together, yeah, can do a big change. Yeah, thank you.
And could I respond with just a couple of other comments, because I think that in politics things are crazy right now, but on the climate side of things, I think there's much that's really changed recently, and that's global markets and affordability of new energy sources, and it's miraculous now that renewables are far cheaper than fossil fuels, and so that the world is a buffered system right now when it comes to moving towards the right outcomes, because nobody would pick fossil fuels if you had to pick now. And so increasingly, we have to drive towards that future, and I think that that's the nice thing. And so around the world, you see that climate change is delivered. Markets are asking for specific things out of fossil fuel companies. It doesn't matter that we see rollbacks in methane rules in the States. Oil and gas companies are still driving ahead, business as usual, reducing, making big plans in that regard. And so, anyways, a lot of the world is crazy, but I actually think that a lot of these climate solutions are actually kind of durable and reliable, and they just need to keep being pushed. And we're on the just starting the downhill slope, I think, actually. And so keep going, keep pushing.
All right. Thank you very much. We're going to take about 10, 15 minutes. If there's any questions in the audience that can be directed at any of our wonderful panel here. Anyone? See? Oh, sorry, there's Mike.
Thank you to everyone for speaking, and thank you especially to Senator Coyle. I suppose this question is also directed to you. I know Lister mentioned that the responsibility now is on Parliament to continue with what the Assembly produced, and I'm wondering if you had any ideas specifically on how the pressure can be kept on Parliament to continue acting in light of all the other issues that the current government is addressing. And specifically, what other opportunities are there for youth who didn't have this specific opportunity to have their voices heard that they might have in the near future?
So what are we going to do about it? Firstly, and then what other opportunities could be there? As I said, we're at an early phase right now, taking it on, understanding it, spreading the word about it. There's spreading the word within Parliament, within the Senate, within the House of Commons, first to those like-minded organizations, Senators for Climate Solutions, which has well over half of the Senate membership. It's over 60 people in Senators for Climate Solutions from all parts of the Senate. The All-Party Climate Caucus, the newly revived Liberal Climate Caucus, all of those vehicles that are there to work with. We have strategies to work with them to really, get this out there and say, and what are you going to do? We're going to do this. What about you? What are you going to do? But I think it's also important what I've heard here and what I've heard from, well, not sure about you, Lister, have you changed your mind? But I think it takes everybody. I think politicians will also listen better if it's coming from their constituents, right, than from their peer parliamentarian. They'll listen to their peer parliamentarian because they respect them, but they're going to act more if they hear it from the people in their constituency. So I think we have to take it in several directions, right? Out to the constituencies in the ways we're doing here, and we were actually, Dylan and I were talking about this just before we came in, how the dissemination of this is really important. And it has a lot of legitimacy for several reasons. One, the people were selected randomly. They were well informed, and they worked really to get closely together to agree on some common things. So there's a lot of legitimacy associated with the recommendations in this document. And as you said, David, it's quite remarkably sophisticated and balanced document, and that makes it, I think, all the more powerful. So that's one thing. Citizens' assemblies in general, this is our first experiment on a citizens' assembly on climate in Canada, and the first in the world with this age group, which is remarkable, right? So we are plugged into something called the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies, which is based at Westminster University, and it brings together all of there was recently a climate assembly in the Netherlands, for example. There've been climate assemblies in a number of places. So it's getting this technique and improving it, mostly improving its impact, right? We don't do it just to do a cool exercise and to come up with a nice little report. We do it to be effective. Next month, I will be down. I'm getting rid of my embargo on traveling to the US. I'm going to Washington to talk with state governors and other state level actors on citizens' assemblies and how important they are for building legitimate practice in their constituencies as well. And I'll be speaking about the Canadian Youth Climate Assembly there. So this is, there's a variety of ways of, continuing this and expanding it in many different ways, not just in one way. And we are because it's our first Citizens Assembly at the national level on climate in Canada, it's something that I want to make sure with all of my collaborators that we bring, to other parliamentarians and make sure that they also own it. That's not Mary Coyle's project, right? Because if it's Mary Coyle's project, it's already a failure. It has to be owned by others. And that's why on that day, September 21st, we did the draft report was reported. You saw the beginning, parts of that there was an hour. There were 21 parliamentarians sitting in that room, right? That was really important. So those 21 own it more than the ones who weren't in the room, right? So using them as well as nodes for expanding this. So those are a few things.
Thank you. My name is Kate Graves. I was in British Columbia when the new government was elected. And I thought at the time, look at those snow-capped mountains. The last time I was here, there was a little bit more snow capped on that mountain. Now, why can't we have a snow cap report come out of Ottawa? What's changing? What's changing in Ottawa on a daily basis? Even if it's just the little changes, we need to hear that something's happening. And we need to make sure that we make something happen ourselves. That's my challenge, because you're both in the humblest beauty in the world, and you come from the most majestic beauty in the world. I think you two could handle it. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. Many people are quite pessimistic about climate change. Some even suggest that we're beyond it even being possible to fix. I don't know, but there are some who say that. Lister, you said early in the presentation that you were more pessimistic after going through this process than before, if I heard you correctly. I guess my question for Lister and for Dylan, do you have hope? Where do you find your hope, if you do have hope? Yeah, just that would be my question.
I'll start because I heard my name, neuron activation. So yeah, I think part of the reason I've become pessimistic isn't necessarily my education. I think part of that, but also just growing up and learning more about how the world works. And I think it's very easy to be pessimistic. And I think the main source of pessimism for me isn't necessarily looking down the barrel of climate change, but it's more the systems of governance, or like the systems that govern us, not just like our government, but say like kind of like modern capitalism, late stage capitalism, whatever you want to call it. I feel like that's what I'm more pessimistic about, because so I'll get to the pessimism and then I'll get to the hope. But it's like, okay, so renewables are getting cheaper. And sorry, cut me off if I'm rambling too much. I'll try and keep it succinct. But like, yes, renewables are getting cheaper. And yes, like if we do nothing, as they're cheaper, eventually it's going to phase out fossil fuels. But just replacing like every barrel of oil with a solar panel, just as an expression, that will maybe solve climate change. But is that going to solve the systemic inequities? Or I guess how I would put it is, I think we're going to solve climate change. I don't think the world is going to become uninhabitable for humanity, but I think it's going to make inequities a lot worse. And I'm worried that if we don't respond to it in a meaningful way, we are going to allow things to get a lot worse for a lot of people. And I think that's kind of sad. I was recently at a lecture at DAL, a guest lecture, where they were talking, and I know international relations and international law is kind of not in shambles, but it's scary right now. But there's been multiple tribunals at the United Nations that are talking more about how our human rights are affected by climate change and how, say, the right to a healthy environment should underpin the other human rights. And so I think there is a lot of positive momentum. And what I get hope from is kind of the people around me and the good things I see around me, because a lot of the things in the greater world are scary. I'm sorry, that was very long, but.
Oh, great. Dylan.
And that was where I get hope. The fact that we have the technology to change the trajectory we're currently on, assuming we recognize our trajectory right now is negative, we're of the belief that we have the technology to change that. And so I'm hopeful that we can make it a positive one.
Next step.
Thank you very much. So as like an economics student, I'm an economics student. It's very easy to see that the biggest challenge we're facing with climate change is the cost. Less so than people being negligent. It's that it's expensive to fight climate change. So we know that there's government measures, subsidies, research and development funding going to entities to help making this transition a bit easier. But I feel like a big challenge is we're not seeing that at the individual level. Like, what is the standard Canadian citizen isn't really experience that benefit to attack climate change and to switch to renewable fuels and whatnot. So I guess my question, it can go to anybody who has any opinion on it, but what can the government do really to promote that more specifically to the individual citizen?
I think the switching cost, although technologies might be available, they might be getting cheaper, it's still going to take a long time. And the switching cost is part of the problem. We have a whole society that's built for burning certain fuels. And I mean, solar panels may be cheaper than building a coal plant long term, but you have to pay for your energy up front, which is the problem. And so the economics of the problem are really the impediments in a lot of ways. It's slowing things down, and I think that those are the areas for innovation these days. I think that like figuring out those systems. There are certainly some bright spots even in fossil fuels, for example, where I don't know if everybody knows, but there isn't one gas price anymore, natural gas price. So provinces like Quebec will pay more for gas for their organic bananas. You can buy two types of bananas at the supermarket, obviously, and they will only pay for natural gas that's produced in a low carbon intensity production environment, and where certain environmental controls exceed regulation by multiple times. So many more checks and measurements that are done, transparency, certifications, and there are a lot of bright lights. But I do completely agree with you that that's the sticking point, and politics is a sticking point as well. And anyways, it'll take a long time to get everybody in alignment, but I think it's not. I think that there are things that we can, there are areas for innovation. I think wherever there are barriers, those are areas for opportunity. We've seen that come on the technical side to some degree already, and now the solutions are available. And so we'll look to the economists of the world for innovation, and the political scientists, whenever the new textbooks are written, then we'll start again. Yeah.
Can I just add, I think that's very important. And you have raised really the nub of the issue for the citizen, right? Which therefore is the issue for politicians. One thing that we heard about, and I didn't attend each of the sessions with the Canadian Youth Climate Assembly because I didn't want to be intrusive, but I did attend some. And One was by the Canadian Climate Institute, somebody representing the Canadian Climate Institute. And one of the things he talked about was the costs of not doing things. And governments have to take these things into account, right? What are the health costs? You know, what are the costs of disasters? What are the costs, you know, of not transitioning as quickly enough to the new economy where the world is going? There's a whole variety of things there that the government has to take into account. And I'm not gonna, you know, give you a lecture on it, but there's what you were saying, Dave, but there's also how the government then has to balance what it does to intervene to support families, households, individuals in their transition versus the bigger economy, right? And weighing that against what it's already costing and what the projections are in terms of what it's going to cost if you don't do that, right? So you know that you economists like to look to the future and make predictions, don't you? So you know what I'm talking about, and that is a huge thing, and that is, as others have said here, Lister, Dave, and others, the political polarization doesn't help that equation at all. That's where you have to go from facts, data, and real data, not just on our own country, but where what is the International Energy Agency saying, and where is Canada lining up with where the world's going, right? And if we don't get on that boat soon, what's that going to cost our economy, right? So there are many considerations that governments have to be on top of, and the common citizen doesn't necessarily know all those things. They don't have to know all those things. They do have to know what you're saying is, what's it going to cost me? And that's where governments have to help out.
I just wanted to add that, I think that when it comes to individuals, it's a matter of choice and a matter of possibilities in your pocket, how much you can put in a carbon tax versus milk or versus, and this is what I'm saying when we are living in very uncertain times where politics is so, uncertain. So the impact on our family budget is deprioritizing climate for many of us. Poverty in Canada in the last 20 years doubled. Yeah, so that's actually a percentage of the population whom they might be, very committed to climate solutions, but they don't have the financial, yeah, exactly, but then my second point is that and I'm not saying that in Canada we did everything that we were supposed to do. Yeah, we have a lot to do. Yeah, but it's not enough for Canada to do everything, because the other countries also have to, and we have big polluters around, and we have, countries that are, in political science, we always point the finger to dictatorships. Dictatorships have a horrible record of when it comes to the environment, but some democracies also need the improvement. Yeah.
Me. Right. It's going to be a question, I guess, buried inside some other things. But it seems to me that as I look at all of this, communication is the thing that we really need to lean into on this. And you've all spoken to this. I'm going to tell a story about a family member I have in Alberta. And we come from a different place when it comes to these matters. And I was talking about subsidization. He said, well, look at the subsidization for wind and solar. I said, but don't you understand how heavily fossil fuels are subsidized? I had no understanding of that, no belief in that. And I found that fascinating, that message isn't out there across Canada, that people aren't getting that message. And Dr. Risk, you talked about the importance of transparency, and that's on one of your mission critical statements. Transparency is so important that that data gets out there and that we can somehow get that out to the general public to understand that. Dr. Stan, your energy is infectious. I can't imagine your students ever falling asleep. And you
ask him, he is taking my 100.
But your call to action, I think, is so important. If we can, have the youth assembly really get out there and help their cohorts, their peers understand this, and then talk to their family members, talk to others to relay this information. And Dr. Risk, you talked about the fact that we're in a lucky place right now with respect to the low cost, and I think that may be a way to get to the people who don't believe so much in the science, but are very interested in the cost of things. And if you look at Texas, they have more wind and solar than California does. It's not because they are concerned about climate change, it's because it's a better deal right now. So we're lucky in that respect. And I guess all of this is leading up to me to ask, what are some thoughts about how we can get the information that's necessary to really relay the picture that we have to get out there in the world and get it through the obstacles that are represented, particularly in social media right now. I feel that there's got to be some way of managing that better than we're doing, because for every positive thing that's said, there's 100 bots or 1,000 bots saying rubbish. And that's scary.
To CBC. Take him to CBC. Every day interview.
Any thoughts from the panel on how to get word out?
This is something Lister spoke about, actually. And I think communication is what you're talking about. And Lister, I thought was really insightful when he said, we always think it's about, talking the other person into seeing the world the way we see it, but it's more important for that to actually happen, to listen, and communication is actually listening first is what helps. And, one of my favorite people on communicating about climate is Catherine Hayhoe, the Canadian atmospheric scientist who works at Texas Tech University, who says there's no one way to communicate about this. There are multiple ways, and you have to understand who your different audiences are. And I think we heard a little bit of that from Lister and from Dylan. And you're actually referring to it in terms of the audience that you're talking about. The online stuff with the bots and all of that, that's a big challenge. The misinformation, the disinformation challenges, and there are nefarious, both government and private interests that are fueling those things, trying to undermine, the transition and the move towards the net zero economy that's coming, right? But I do think that there's so many different levels to that communication question, but it is a central one. And I think that was one of the reasons that we started Senators for Climate Solutions, quite frankly. We wanted a great big tent, as we say in Canada, a big tent, so that people from all backgrounds could find a place within that organization, Senators for Climate Solutions. Some, aren't going to agree on what those solutions are, but we all agree we got to get to net zero, right? And so if we learn together and we base our actions on the expert advice that we get and the incredible hard work that these young people have done as well, then that can serve us well in our group, right? And I think that we need more of that kind of thing, because otherwise we end up being polarizing and just exacerbating this problem, right? And being holier than thou. Everybody hates holier than thou, right? So being respectful, listening, and leading with facts, and meeting people where they are. I think those are the best we can do. Do you want to say anything, Dylan? Or Lister?
Nope, that was good.
Quoting you. I was going to offer them a last chance to say any last words they wanted to add to this evening, if they had any final thoughts before we closed off.
Thank you for organizing CYCA.
Yep, much the same. Thanks. I mean, the point, is anybody listening? I think some people are listening, so that's great. And thank you for listening to us.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us this evening. Our thanks go to Senator Coyle for not only organizing or co-organizing this wonderful event around the Canadian Youth Climate Summit, but also for inviting the Mulroney Institute to partner with her this evening on tonight's event. Our thanks go to her office. I'll put a plug, especially Asta Marie Stalker, not that I know the woman. That's my daughter, for her organizational work on tonight's event. On the ground here, our thanks go to Anna Zhuschlag and our tech guru, Jim, for making sure things went smoothly. To our discussants for their wonderful insights, but most importantly, thanks to our youth delegates for caring enough about our future to participate and work towards generational priorities to make our future better. So just if you know the Mulroney Institute, we always have events going on. So I just want to take a moment to plug 2 events that are coming up in the near future. We have Dr. Peter Clancy, who will be speaking on the 29th around university governance in the 21st century, and specifically talking about the private university that collapsed in BC. And then on February the 3rd, we're having a panel on the Arctic, where we have 2 of our chairs and fellows, Dr. Peter Kickert, Dr. Adam Lajeunesse, and they will be joined by Sandy Silver, the former Premier of the Yukon, to talk about the challenges we are facing in the Arctic. And I'm sure Greenland will come up once or twice during that time. So please join us for that. For students in the audience, I also want to plug that Sandy Silver, who is also our practitioner in residence, will be hosting workshops over the next couple of weeks. The theme is around the honor to serve. So he will take you from finding your platform to becoming premier of a territory. So if you haven't already signed up for that, there's an RSVP out there just to make sure we have a big enough room to house folks. So please, it's a wonderful opportunity to get all this wonderful depth of information, skills, and experience that Mr. Silver brings to us here. What's that?
His office hours.
Oh, and he does have office hours. He likes to chat. Sometimes he has candy in there. So it's up on the 4th floor, Tuesdays from 12:30 to 4:30. And it's just a drop-in. So he's very nice, not intimidating, even though he was a premier. So then, folks, thank you again for joining us. Please travel safe out there, and we'll see you at the next event.